Behind the
I fear for what
perfectly
comes
orchestrated
next.
smiles
We will face it
and
together.
carefully choreographed
Promise.
public
I promise.
appearances lies a
William, I'm
story
so
that the
worried
world
about
was
you.
never
I
meant
know,
to know.
darling, but
In
I
the
have to
gilded
do
halls
this.
of
Just
Kensington
promise me you'll be
Palace, where
careful.
every whisper
so worried
echoes
about
with the
this.
weight of
I know,
centuries of
but we must
tradition,
be strong.
Prince William
right.
and
We'll face it together.
Catherine faced a decision that would forever change not just their lives, but the very foundation of the British monarchy itself. It was a choice made in the shadows of duty and love, where the price of being royal demanded sacrifices that no amount of wealth or privilege could justify. A choice so profound and heartbreaking that it required absolute silence, even as it tore at the very fabric of their souls. What happens when the future king and queen of England must choose between their deepest personal convictions and the unforgiving demands of the crown? What price are they willing to pay to protect not just their family, but an institution that has stood for over 1,000 years? This is the untold story of a moment that tested the limits of royal duty, pushed the boundaries of unconditional love, and revealed the true cost of wearing a crown that can never be removed. A story of courage in the face of impossible odds, of love that transcends protocol, and of a decision that would echo through generations yet to come. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. Some choices are too painful to acknowledge. But some stories, no matter how carefully guarded, demand to be told. The morning mist clung to the windows of Kensington Palace like a veil of secrecy, obscuring the world beyond and creating an almost ethereal atmosphere within the royal residence. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, stood motionless at the tall French windows of the drawing room, her silhouette framed against the gray London sky. Her fingers traced delicate patterns on the condensation that had formed on the glass, each touch leaving behind invisible marks that would disappear as quickly as they appeared, much like the fleeting moments of normalcy she so desperately craved. The palace around her hummed with its usual morning activities. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled by centuries-old Persian rugs that had witnessed countless royal secrets. The sound of distant conversations drifted through the air, punctuated by the occasional ring of a telephone or the soft closing of heavy wooden doors. Yet despite all this activity, Catherine felt utterly alone, trapped in a bubble of isolation that seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. Prince William emerged from his private study, his usually composed demeanor betraying subtle signs of the stress that had been consuming him for weeks. His shoulders carried the weight of unspoken burdens, and his eyes held a distant quality that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. He moved toward Catherine with a measured gait that had been ingrained in him since childhood. But there was something different in his approach today, something that suggested the careful composure he had maintained was beginning to crack. The morning briefing from the palace press office, William said softly, extending a manila folder toward his wife. His voice carried the formal tone that had become second nature to him in recent months, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of something far more personal and vulnerable. Catherine turned from the window, her eyes immediately drawn to the concerned expression that William was trying so hard to conceal. The folder contained newspaper clippings, online articles, and social media reports, all carefully compiled and annotated by the Royal Communications team. Each piece represented another fragment of speculation, another attempt by the media to pierce through the carefully constructed facade that surrounded their lives. Catherine scanned the headlines with growing unease, recognizing the familiar pattern of inquiry that had been building momentum over the past several weeks. "They're getting closer," Catherine observed, her voice barely above a whisper. She set the folder down on the mahogany table that dominated the center of the room, its polished surface reflecting the worried expressions that neither of them could quite hide. The morning light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the documents, creating an almost ominous atmosphere that seemed to emphasize the gravity of their situation. William moved to stand beside her, his presence offering a comfort that transcended words. They had weathered many storms together since their marriage, but this felt different, more personal, more threatening to everything they had built together. The silence that stretched between them was filled with unspoken understanding, the kind of communication that develops between two people who have learned to navigate the treacherous waters of public life while trying to protect something precious and private. "We always knew this day might come," William said finally, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for moments like this. He reached for Catherine's hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become their anchor during turbulent times. The simple act of physical connection served as a reminder of what they were fighting to protect, of the love that had sustained them through countless challenges and would need to sustain them through whatever lay ahead. The decision they faced was not one that could be made lightly or quickly. It involved considerations that extended far beyond their personal desires and preferences, touching on matters of constitutional significance, family tradition, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. Every option carried consequences that would ripple through generations, affecting not just their immediate family, but the institution they represented and the millions of people who looked to them for leadership and stability. Catherine moved away from the table, her steps taking her to the ornate fireplace that dominated one wall of the room. Above the mantelpiece hung a portrait of Queen Elizabeth II in her younger years, her steady gaze seeming to observe everything that transpired within these walls. The painting served as a constant reminder of the legacy they had inherited and the expectations that came with their positions, expectations that sometimes felt impossible to fulfill while maintaining any semblance of personal authenticity. "Your grandmother," Catherine said softly, her eyes fixed on the portrait. "What would she have done in our situation?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with the knowledge that the late queen had faced her own impossible choices throughout her long reign, decisions that had required her to sacrifice personal happiness for the greater good of the monarchy and the nation she served. William joined her by the fireplace, his gaze also drawn to the familiar image that had been a source of guidance and inspiration throughout his life. "She would have chosen duty," he said simply, but the words carried a complexity that belied their straightforward nature. Duty, for members of the royal family, was never a simple concept. It involved layers of obligation, tradition, and expectation that often conflicted with basic human desires for privacy, normalcy, and the freedom to make choices based on personal conviction rather than public perception. The telephone on the side table rang with sharp insistence, its shrill tone cutting through the contemplative atmosphere like a knife. William glanced at the caller identification before answering, his expression immediately shifting to one of professional attentiveness. Catherine watched as he engaged in what was clearly a complex conversation with someone from the palace communications team, his responses measured and diplomatic even as the tension in his posture continued to build. When the call ended, William remained silent for several moments, his thoughts clearly racing as he processed whatever information he had just received. Catherine waited patiently, having learned long ago that these moments of internal deliberation were crucial to his decision-making process. She could see the conflict playing out across his features, the struggle between his natural instinct to protect his family and his deeply ingrained sense of duty to the crown and the people he would someday serve as their king. "They want a statement by the end of the week," William said finally, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to echo through the room. "Something definitive that will either confirm or deny the speculation that's been circulating." The deadline represented more than just a media management exercise. It was a moment of truth that would require them to reveal something they had hoped to keep private for much longer, if not forever. Catherine felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the room. She had always known that privacy was a luxury that came with significant limitations when you were a member of the royal family. But she had hoped that some aspects of their personal lives could remain sacred, protected from the relentless scrutiny that followed their every public appearance. The reality that they were running out of options, out of time, and out of places to hide was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The afternoon brought a succession of meetings with various advisors, each offering their own perspective on the situation and the potential consequences of different courses of action. The palace's most senior staff members, people who had devoted their careers to protecting and promoting the interests of the royal family, presented carefully researched arguments for various approaches to the growing media interest. Legal experts outlined the constitutional implications of different choices, while communications specialists discussed the potential impact on public perception and the monarchy's reputation. Through it all, William and Catherine sat side by side, listening to advice that ranged from the practical to the philosophical, from the politically expedient to the morally challenging. Each expert brought decades of experience and deep institutional knowledge to their recommendations. Yet none could fully appreciate the personal cost that any decision would exact from the two people at the center of the controversy. As evening approached and the last of the advisors departed, William and Catherine found themselves alone once again in their private quarters. The weight of the day's discussions hung heavy between them, each conversation having added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. They moved through their evening routines with the mechanical precision of people who were functioning on emotional autopilot, going through the motions of normalcy, while their minds grappled with choices that would define their future. The children's bedtime routine provided a welcome respite from the intensity of the day's deliberations. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis brought an energy and innocence to the evening that served as a powerful reminder of what was truly at stake in the decisions that lay ahead. Their laughter and excited chatter filled the nursery with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold calculations that had dominated the adult conversations throughout the day. Catherine sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed, reading from a beloved storybook that had been a favorite for months. The familiar words provided comfort not just to the little princess, but to her mother as well, offering a connection to simpler times when a most difficult decision involved choosing which book to read before sleep. William stood in the doorway, watching this nightly ritual with an expression that mixed profound love with deep concern about the world his children were growing up in. As the children settled into sleep, William and Catherine retreated to their own bedroom, finally, allowing themselves to drop the composed facade they had maintained throughout the long day. The room, decorated in soothing blues and creams, had always been their sanctuary, a place where they could speak freely without concern for protocol or public perception. Tonight, however, even this private space felt somehow compromised, invaded by the external pressures that were forcing them toward a decision they were not ready to make. Catherine sat at her dressing table, slowly removing the jewelry that had become as much a part of her public identity as her carefully chosen words and practiced smiles. Each piece represented a different aspect of her role as a member of the royal family, symbols of tradition and continuity that connected her to centuries of history and expectation. As she placed each item in its designated spot, she felt as though she was shedding pieces of an identity that had never quite fit comfortably, despite years of trying to adapt to its requirements. William appeared behind her in the mirror, his reflection showing the exhaustion that he had successfully hidden from everyone else throughout the day. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders, the gesture conveying support and solidarity, even as both of them struggled with the knowledge that their time for delay and deliberation was rapidly running out. The silence between them was comfortable, yet charged with unspoken thoughts and fears about what the coming days would bring. The night stretched ahead of them, hours of darkness that should have provided rest and restoration, but instead promised more sleepless contemplation of impossible choices. Tomorrow would bring new pressures, new deadlines, and new challenges to their carefully maintained privacy. The decision that had been looming over them for weeks was crystallizing into an unavoidable reality, one that would require them to choose between competing loyalties and conflicting obligations. In the quiet of their bedroom, surrounded by the familiar comforts of their private life, William and Catherine prepared to face whatever tomorrow would bring, knowing that their lives and the lives of their children would never be quite the same again. Dawn broke over London with an unusual clarity, as if the city itself was preparing to witness something significant. Inside Kensington Palace, William woke before his alarm, his internal clock disturbed by the weight of unresolved decisions. Catherine lay beside him, her breathing steady but her face troubled even in sleep, suggesting that their dilemma had followed her into her dreams. The morning light filtering through the heavy curtains created patterns on the bedroom wall that seemed to shift and change, much like the options they faced with each passing hour. The previous evening had ended without resolution, but the new day brought with it an urgency that could no longer be ignored. William dressed quietly, choosing the familiar comfort of his naval uniform for the morning's engagement, though the formal attire felt heavier than usual, weighted with symbolism and expectation. Each button and insignia represented aspects of his identity that had been predetermined before his birth, roles, and responsibilities that left little room for personal preference or individual desire. Catherine moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, selecting clothes that would photograph, while maintaining the appropriate level of formality for her scheduled appearances. The process had become so automatic that she could complete it while her mind focused on more pressing concerns. But today she found herself pausing before each decision, wondering how many more times she would need to consider the public implications of such private choices. Their breakfast together in the morning room was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Simon Wellington, the palace's most senior private secretary, whose early appearance signaled the escalating nature of their situation. Sir Simon had served the royal family for over 3 decades, navigating countless crises with diplomatic skill and unwavering loyalty. His presence this morning, however, carried an unusual gravity that immediately commanded their attention. "Your Royal Highnesses," Sir Simon began, his voice carrying the formal tone that always preceded serious discussions. "We've received additional information overnight that significantly changes the timeline we're working with." He placed a leather portfolio on the table between them, his movements deliberate and careful, as if the documents within contained explosive material that required the utmost caution in handling. The portfolio contained intelligence reports from the palace's media monitoring team, showing a coordinated effort among several major news organizations to investigate the rumors that had been circulating for weeks. The evidence suggested that multiple journalists were working independently toward the same conclusion, creating a perfect storm of scrutiny that would be impossible to deflect or redirect. The usual strategies of distraction and misdirection that had served the royal family well in previous crises would not be sufficient to address this particular challenge. William studied the documents with the analytical mind that had served him well in his military career, quickly identifying the key patterns and potential vulnerabilities in their current position. Catherine read more slowly, taking time to absorb not just the factual content, but the emotional implications of what the documents revealed about the extent to which their private lives had become subjects of professional investigation. "How long do we have?" William asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer would not be what he wanted to hear. Sir Simon's expression confirmed his fears before the words were even spoken. 48 hours at most," Sir Simon replied. "Possibly less if any of these outlets decides to move forward without additional confirmation." The short time frame eliminated many of the options they had been considering, forcing them into a much more limited range of possible responses. Catherine set down the documents and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. The familiar view that had provided comfort and perspective during countless previous crises now seemed somehow different, as if she was seeing it through the lens of potential loss. The carefully maintained grounds, with their precise arrangements of seasonal flowers and meticulously trimmed hedges, represented the kind of order and control that their situation was rapidly moving beyond. "We need to discuss this privately," William said to Sir Simon, using the diplomatic language that indicated the need for absolute confidentiality. Sir Simon nodded his understanding and withdrew, leaving the couple alone to confront the reality that their time for deliberation had essentially expired. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of all the conversations they had avoided having, all the possibilities they had refused to fully explore because acknowledging them felt too much like accepting defeat. Now, with external pressures forcing their hand, they could no longer afford the luxury of indefinite consideration. "Tell me what you're thinking," Catherine said softly, turning back from the window to face her husband. William's expression revealed the internal struggle between his roles as a private individual, a husband and father, and a future king whose decisions would affect millions of people he would never meet. "I'm thinking about our children," William replied honestly, "about the world we're creating for them, and whether we have the right to make choices that will fundamentally alter their futures without their input or consent." The observation touched on one of the most complex aspects of royal life, the way in which personal decisions inevitably became matters of constitutional and historical significance. Catherine moved to sit beside him, their physical proximity providing emotional support as they navigated the most difficult conversation of their marriage. "But we also have to consider what happens if we do nothing," she said gently. "If we allow others to control the narrative and define our choices for us." The morning progressed with a series of encrypted phone calls to family members and trusted advisors, each conversation adding another perspective to their deliberations while simultaneously reinforcing the complexity of their situation. William's father, King Charles, offered his support while acknowledging that the ultimate decision had to be theirs to make. His counsel carried the weight of his own experience with impossible choices, his understanding of the personal cost that royal duty could exact from those called to serve. Princess and provided a characteristically direct assessment of their options, her analysis cutting through emotional considerations to focus on practical implications and long-term consequences. Her perspective, shaped by decades of public service and media scrutiny, offered valuable insights into the likely outcomes of different approaches to their current dilemma. By midday, the palace had received confirmation that at least 2 major news organizations were planning to publish stories within the next 24 hours, regardless of whether the royal family chose to provide official comment or cooperation. This development effectively eliminated their option to maintain silence, forcing them to choose between controlling their own narrative and allowing others to define their story for them. Catherine spent the afternoon in her private study, drafting and redrafting letters that might never be sent, exploring through writing the thoughts and feelings she found difficult to express in conversation. The act of putting words on paper had always helped her clarify her thinking, transforming abstract emotions into concrete considerations that could be evaluated and discussed more objectively. Meanwhile, William met with constitutional experts and senior clergy to explore the potential long-term implications of various courses of action. These consultations revealed the complex web of law, tradition, and expectation that governed royal behavior, highlighting how personal choices by senior members of the family inevitably became matters of national and international significance. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Princess Beatrice, whose own experience navigating media attention while maintaining her professional career offered a unique perspective on balancing public and private identities. Her conversation with Catherine provided insights from someone who had successfully carved out space for personal authenticity within the constraints of royal protocol. As evening approached, William and Catherine found themselves back in the drawing room where their day had begun, the familiar space now feeling like a sanctuary under siege. The windows that had earlier offered a view of peaceful gardens now seemed to reveal a world full of watching eyes and listening ears, a reminder of the constant scrutiny that made their current situation both inevitable and unbearable. Their dinner was interrupted by the arrival of urgent communication from the palace's intelligence services, providing real-time updates on the investigation efforts being conducted by various news organizations. The reports painted a picture of determined journalists following multiple leads, cross-referencing sources, and building toward conclusions that would be impossible to deny or discredit once published. "We're running out of road," William observed as they reviewed the latest intelligence reports. His choice of words reflected his understanding that they had reached a point where forward momentum was the only option, regardless of their personal preferences or desires for more time to consider their choices. Catherine nodded, recognizing that the external pressures had reached a critical mass that would force action regardless of their readiness to act. "Then, we need to make sure we're the ones driving," she replied, her words carrying a determination that surprised them both with its clarity and conviction. The evening's final phone call came from the Prime Minister's office, offering government support while emphasizing the constitutional implications of whatever decision the royal couple ultimately made. The conversation served as a reminder that their personal crisis was also a matter of national interest, with potential ramifications extending far beyond their immediate family to touch on questions of governmental stability and international relationships. As they prepared for bed, William and Catherine both understood that they would likely wake the next morning to find their world fundamentally changed. The decision they had hoped to delay indefinitely was crystallizing into unavoidable reality, shaped by external pressures, but ultimately requiring them to choose who they wanted to be in the face of impossible circumstances. The last hours of their old life stretched ahead of them, filled with the kind of profound silence that precedes irreversible change. Tomorrow would demand answers they were still struggling to formulate, choices they had never wanted to make, and a level of public honesty they had spent years learning to avoid. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of their private quarters, they held on to each other and the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The emergency meeting convened at 7 o'clock in the morning in the Queen's conference room, a space that had witnessed countless momentous decisions throughout British history. The oval mahogany table, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the tense faces of the assembled advisors, constitutional experts, and senior palace staff who had been summoned on short notice. William and Catherine entered together, their composed exterior masking the sleepless night they had endured while wrestling with their impossible decision. Sir Simon Wellington stood at the head of the table, a stack of newspapers and printed internet articles arranged before him like evidence in a trial. The headlines varied in their approach, but all pointed toward the same devastating conclusion that the royal couple had been dreading for months. The careful wall of silence they had constructed around their most private matter was crumbling with alarming speed, and the fragments were being examined by journalists around the world. "The Guardian will publish at noon today," Sir Simon announced without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "The Telegraph has indicated they will follow within hours, and we have confirmation that international outlets are preparing similar coverage." He gestured toward the assembled materials, each representing another crack in the facade they had worked so desperately to maintain. Catherine's hands remained steady as she reached for one of the newspapers, though William noticed the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated the internal struggle she was fighting to maintain her composure. The article she examined was written with the careful language of investigative journalism, presenting facts and observations that built toward an inevitable conclusion without making direct accusations that could invite legal challenge. "Were they saying specifically?" William asked, though his tone suggested he was preparing himself for confirmation of his worst fears rather than hoping for good news. Sir Simon consulted his notes, his expression reflecting the delicate nature of the information he was about to share. "They're reporting on discrepancies in the official records," Sir Simon replied carefully. "Inconsistencies in dates, unexplained absences from public duties, and testimony from sources who claim to have direct knowledge of the situation." The euphemistic language could not disguise the serious nature of the allegations, implications that struck at the heart of the trust between the royal family and the British people. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, the palace's constitutional advisor, cleared her throat to draw attention to the legal implications of the developing situation. Her presence at the meeting signaled the gravity of the constitutional questions that would inevitably arise once the story became public knowledge. "We need to consider the precedents," she said quietly. "The implications for succession, for the oath of allegiance, for the relationship between the Crown and Parliament. The words hung in the air like a judgment, reminding everyone present that this was not simply a personal crisis for two individuals, but a potential constitutional emergency that could require intervention at the highest levels of government. The British monarchy had weathered many scandals and controversies throughout its long history, but certain types of revelations carried unique dangers to the institution's stability and legitimacy. William studied the faces around the table, recognizing in their expressions the same mixture of concern and calculation that had characterized every major royal crisis he had witnessed throughout his life. These were people who had devoted their careers to protecting and preserving the monarchy, and their obvious anxiety about the current situation spoke volumes about the potential consequences of what was about to unfold. "What are our options?" Catherine asked, her voice carrying a strength that impressed everyone present. Despite the personal nature of the crisis, she was approaching it with the analytical mindset that had served her well in her transition from private citizen to senior royal family member. Her question invited practical discussion rather than emotional speculation, focusing the room's attention on actionable solutions rather than inevitable problems. Sir Simon exchanged glances with Dr. Thornfield before responding, their silent communication suggesting that they had already discussed the limited range of possibilities available to the royal couple. "We can issue a strong denial and threaten legal action," he began, though his tone indicated skepticism about the effectiveness of such an approach. "We can provide a partial acknowledgement that attempts to control the narrative, or we can offer complete transparency and hope that honesty generates more sympathy than condemnation." Each option carried significant risks and potential benefits, but none offered the possibility of returning to the status quo that had protected their privacy for so long. The choice they faced was not between revelation and concealment, but between different forms of public exposure, each with its own implications for their family and their roles within the monarchy. The morning progressed with detailed discussions of messaging strategies, legal vulnerabilities, and constitutional precedents. Communications experts presented polling data that suggested public attitudes toward various types of royal revelations, while security advisors outlined the potential threats that could emerge from increased media attention and public scrutiny. Through it all, William and Catherine listened with the focused attention of students cramming for the most important examination of their lives. They asked probing questions, requested clarification on complex points, and gradually developed a comprehensive understanding of the landscape they would be navigating in the coming days and weeks. The most difficult moment came when Dr. Thornfield presented her analysis of the constitutional implications of complete honesty. Her research had uncovered historical precedents that suggested certain types of admissions by senior royals could trigger formal parliamentary review of succession arrangements, potentially affecting not just William and Catherine, but their children as well. "We're not just talking about newspaper headlines," Dr. Thornfield explained gently. "We're potentially discussing fundamental questions about the future of the monarchy itself." Her words forced everyone in the room to confront the possibility that their personal crisis could become a catalyst for much larger changes to the British constitutional system. Catherine felt a chill run through her as she absorbed the full implications of what Dr. Thornfield was saying. The idea that their private struggle could somehow threaten the institution they had devoted their lives to serving seemed almost surreal. Yet the constitutional experts' careful research made the possibility impossible to dismiss. William's response surprised everyone present, including Catherine. "Maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing," he said quietly, his words carrying a thoughtfulness that suggested he had been considering this possibility for some time. "Maybe it's time for the monarchy to be honest about what it means to be human while trying to serve an institution that often demands the opposite." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what William had just said. His observation touched on fundamental questions about the role of the monarchy in modern society, the relationship between public service and personal authenticity, and the sustainability of an institution built on maintaining perfect facades in an era of unprecedented transparency. Sir Simon was the first to break the silence, his diplomatic training helping him navigate the delicate territory that William's comment had opened. "Your Royal Highness raises important philosophical questions," he said carefully. "But we also need to consider the immediate practical implications of any course of action we choose to pursue." The practical implications were indeed overwhelming. The palace's communications team presented detailed scenarios showing how different approaches to the crisis could affect everything from tourism revenue to international diplomatic relationships. The British monarchy was not just a domestic institution, but a global brand whose reputation had far-reaching economic and political consequences. As the meeting progressed into the afternoon, the weight of accumulated information and analysis began to take its toll on everyone present. The complexity of the situation seemed to multiply with each additional perspective that was offered, creating a web of competing considerations that made clear decision-making increasingly difficult. Catherine requested a brief recess, needing time to process everything she had heard and to reconnect with her own instincts about what felt right rather than what seemed strategically optimal. She stepped onto the private terrace that adjoined the conference room, breathing deeply of the London air that carried the sense of approaching autumn and the subtle pollution that marked urban life. William joined her after a few moments, their wordless communication more effective than all the expert advice they had received throughout the long day. Standing together in the afternoon sunlight, they both felt the weight of history and expectation that surrounded their decision, but also the simple human desire to be true to themselves and to each other. "What does your heart tell you?" William asked, using the kind of direct emotional language that they rarely employed in formal settings, but that felt necessary given the magnitude of what they faced. Catherine considered the question carefully, recognizing that it was perhaps the most important thing anyone had asked her all day. "My heart tells me that we've been living with this secret for too long," she replied honestly. "That keeping it hidden has been more destructive to us and to our family than revealing it could possibly be." Her admission carried the weight of months of internal struggle, of sleepless nights, and careful calculations that had ultimately led to this moment of clarity. The afternoon session focused on practical preparations for various scenarios, with detailed timelines and communication strategies being developed for different possible approaches to the crisis. The palace's crisis management team, veterans of previous royal controversies, worked with military precision to prepare for every conceivable outcome. But beneath all the strategic planning and tactical considerations lay a simpler truth that both William and Catherine were beginning to acknowledge. They were tired of hiding, tired of the constant vigilance required to maintain their secret, and tired of the ways in which their concealment was affecting their relationship with each other and their children. As evening approached and the deadline for their decision drew near, they faced one final consultation with the Archbishop of Canterbury, whose counsel was sought on the moral and spiritual dimensions of their situation. His perspective offered a different framework for understanding their dilemma, one that emphasized integrity and truth-telling as fundamental virtues that transcended strategic considerations. The Archbishop's gentle wisdom helped them recognize that their struggle was not just about managing a public relations crisis, but about defining who they wanted to be as individuals and as a family. His blessing for whatever decision they ultimately made provided a spiritual foundation that supported their growing conviction that honesty, however difficult, was preferable to continued concealment. As night fell over London and the palace prepared for what could be its most challenging communications crisis in decades, William and Catherine finally knew what they had to do. The decision would require courage they were not sure they possessed, but it would also offer them something they had been missing for too long: the possibility of living with complete integrity, regardless of the consequences. The palace corridors echoed with unusual activity as staff members prepared for what they had been told was an unprecedented situation requiring maximum discretion and efficiency. Communications specialists worked through the night, drafting multiple versions of statements that could be deployed depending on how events unfolded. Security teams reviewed protocols for managing increased media attention and public scrutiny, while senior advisors coordinated with government officials to ensure constitutional procedures were properly followed. William and Catherine had retreated to their private quarters for what they knew would be their final hours of relative normalcy before their world changed forever. The children had been settled for the night with extra attention and care, though George, at his age, had begun to sense the unusual tension that had permeated the palace atmosphere for weeks. His questions about why there were so many serious-faced adults having whispered conversations had been deflected with gentle reassurances, but both parents knew that complete honesty with their children was now only hours away. In the quiet of their bedroom, Catherine sat at her writing desk, crafting a letter to her own family that would explain what was about to happen and why. The words came slowly, each sentence requiring careful consideration as she tried to convey not just the facts of their situation, but the emotional journey that had brought them to this point. Her parents had been supportive throughout her royal journey, but this would test their understanding and acceptance in ways that nothing previous had done. William stood by the window overlooking the palace gardens, his mind racing through scenarios and potential consequences with the strategic thinking that had been ingrained in him since childhood. The military training that had shaped his approach to problem-solving was serving him well in this crisis, helping him maintain focus on objectives and outcomes rather than becoming overwhelmed by emotional considerations. "Are you certain this is what you want to do?" Catherine asked softly, looking up from her letter to study her husband's profile against the night sky. The question carried layers of meaning, acknowledging that while they had reached this decision together, the consequences would affect him differently because of his position in the line of succession. William turned from the window, his expression reflecting the gravity of what they were about to undertake, while also showing a sense of relief that surprised them both. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied, his voice carrying a conviction that had been building throughout their long deliberations. "We can't continue living with this shadow over everything we do. Our children deserve better, and so do we." The midnight call from Sir Simon confirmed what they had already suspected. The major news outlets had moved beyond their stated deadlines, and were preparing to publish within hours, regardless of any official palace response. This development eliminated their last opportunity for delay, transforming their choice from a theoretical exercise into an immediate operational necessity. Their final preparations took on the character of a military operation, with detailed timelines and communication protocols being implemented to manage the complex logistics of their revelation. The palace's media team had prepared briefing materials for friendly journalists, while legal experts stood ready to address constitutional questions that would inevitably arise from parliamentary quarters and international observers. The most emotionally challenging aspect of their preparation involved recording a video message that would be released simultaneously with their written statement. Standing together in the informal setting of their private sitting room, they practiced the words they had crafted to explain their situation to the public, speaking directly to the camera with the kind of authentic vulnerability that their royal training had taught them to avoid. "We want to speak to you directly about something that has been a private matter for our family," Catherine began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were revealing. "We've always believed that we had a right to keep certain aspects of our lives private, but we've come to realize that honesty and transparency are more important than privacy when that privacy requires us to compromise our integrity." William continued seamlessly, their practice coordination evident even in this unprecedented situation. "We've made mistakes, and we've struggled with decisions that seemed impossible to make. But we've learned that the only way forward is with complete honesty, both with ourselves and with the people we serve." The recording session required multiple takes as they refined their approach, balancing the need for authenticity with the formal requirements of an official royal statement. Each version brought them closer to the tone they wanted to achieve, conveying both their regret for any deception and their determination to move forward with complete transparency. Dawn approached with unusual swiftness, as if time itself was accelerating toward the moment when their private crisis would become public knowledge. The palace's day shift arrived to find an institution transformed by crisis management protocols, with additional security measures in place and communication systems operating at maximum capacity. The morning brought a final round of consultations with family members who had not yet been fully briefed on the situation. King Charles arrived at Kensington Palace before 6 o'clock, his presence providing both practical support and emotional reinforcement for the difficult day ahead. His own experience with public scrutiny and media crisis made him uniquely qualified to offer guidance during these final hours. Princess Anne's arrival shortly afterwards signaled the royal family's united front in supporting William and Catherine's decision, despite her well-known preference for handling family matters privately. Her practical approach to crisis management proved invaluable in finalizing operational details that would determine how smoothly their revelation was managed. The children's morning routine proceeded with carefully maintained normalcy, though both parents were acutely aware that this might be the last time they could shield their young family from the full intensity of public scrutiny. George, Charlotte, and Louis went through their breakfast and preparation for school activities without any awareness that their lives were about to change dramatically. At 9 o'clock, Sir Simon received confirmation that The Guardian story was entering final editing and would be published online within 2 hours, with print distribution following immediately. This intelligence triggered the final phase of the palace's response plan, setting in motion a carefully choreographed sequence of actions designed to maintain maximum control over the narrative while acknowledging the fundamental truth of what was being revealed. Catherine's final private moments were spent in prayer, drawing on the spiritual resources that had sustained her through previous challenges and would need to sustain her through whatever lay ahead. The chapel at Kensington Palace provided a sanctuary where she could find peace and strength before facing what would undoubtedly be the most scrutinized day of her life. William used his final quiet moments to review intelligence reports about public sentiment and media reaction trends, applying his analytical skills to prepare for the various scenarios that could unfold over the coming hours and days. His military background had taught him the importance of comprehensive preparation, and he was determined to be ready for whatever challenges emerged from their decision to embrace complete transparency. The 10 o'clock briefing brought together all senior staff members for final coordination of their response strategy. Communications teams confirmed their readiness to manage incoming media requests. Legal advisors reviewed their prepared statements about constitutional implications, and security specialists outlined enhanced protection measures for all family members. At exactly 10:30, Sir Simon received the call they had been expecting. The Guardian story was live on their website and being distributed through their print network. The headline was carefully worded, but devastating in its implications, confirming the rumors that had been circulating while raising new questions about the timing and extent of the revelations. Within minutes, other news outlets began publishing their own versions of the story, each adding details and perspectives that painted an increasingly complete picture of the situation the royal couple had been hiding. Social media platforms exploded with commentary and speculation, creating a digital storm that would influence public opinion for days to come. "It's time," William said simply, looking around the room at the faces of people who had devoted their careers to protecting and serving the royal family. Their expressions reflected a mixture of concern and admiration, worry about the challenges ahead balanced by respect for the courage required to choose truth over comfort. Catherine stood beside her husband, her composure reflecting the inner strength that had carried her through her transformation from private citizen to senior royal family member. Together, they prepared to face the cameras, the questions, and the judgment that would follow their decision to choose honesty over concealment. The press conference was scheduled for noon, giving them just enough time to review their prepared remarks one final time and to steel themselves for what would be the most consequential public appearance of their lives. As they walked toward the room, where dozens of journalists waited with questions that would probe every aspect of their revelation, they held hands tightly, drawing strength from each other and from their shared conviction that they were finally doing what was right. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. The white drawing room at Kensington Palace had been transformed into a makeshift press conference venue, with cameras positioned to capture the most flattering angles while maintaining the dignity appropriate for such a momentous occasion. 2 chairs had been placed before the assembled media representatives, their positioning carefully calculated to convey unity and mutual support while allowing both William and Catherine to be clearly seen and heard by the international audience that would be watching. As the royal couple entered the room, the usual cacophony of camera shutters and whispered commentary fell to an unusual silence. The gravity of the moment was understood by everyone present, journalists and palace staff alike, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the modern history of the British monarchy. William and Catherine took their seats with the composed dignity that had characterized their public appearances throughout their marriage. But beneath the familiar facade lay an emotional vulnerability that was impossible to completely conceal. "Thank you all for coming," William began, his voice carrying the authority of his royal training while also conveying the personal nature of what they were about to share. "Catherine and I have asked for this opportunity to speak directly to you and to the British people about something that has been weighing heavily on our hearts and minds for many months." The statement they had prepared was unlike anything the palace had ever released, abandoning the careful euphemisms and diplomatic language that typically characterized royal communications in favor of direct, honest acknowledgement of their struggle. Catherine's voice joined William's as they took turns explaining the circumstances that had led them to this moment, their words carrying the weight of truth that had been suppressed for too long. "We made a choice several years ago that we believed was in the best interests of our family and our ability to serve the crown," Catherine explained, her composure remarkable given the personal nature of what she was revealing. "That choice required us to maintain a privacy that has become increasingly difficult to preserve, and we've come to realize that our silence was causing more harm than our honesty ever could." The revelation they shared with the world that afternoon was both simpler and more complex than the rumors and speculation had suggested. Years earlier, faced with medical advice that had profound implications for their family planning and their roles as future monarchs, they had made decisions that prioritized their children's well-being over traditional royal protocol. Those decisions had required them to conceal certain medical procedures and treatments, creating a web of necessary deceptions that had grown increasingly burdensome over time. The questions from the assembled journalists were respectful but probing, each seeking to understand not just the facts of what had been revealed, but the reasoning behind the choices that had led to such an unprecedented moment of royal transparency. William and Catherine answered with a frankness that surprised even their own communications team, refusing to hide behind the usual royal evasions and carefully crafted non-responses. "Why choose to reveal this now?" asked Sarah Mitchell from BBC News, her question reflecting the curiosity of millions of viewers about the timing of such a personal disclosure. William's response revealed the external pressures that had forced their hand, while also acknowledging their own growing desire for authenticity. "We realized that living with this secret was changing us in ways that we didn't like," William replied honestly. "We were becoming more guarded, more suspicious, more afraid of making mistakes that might lead to discovery. That's not who we want to be as individuals, as parents, or as public servants." Catherine's addition to his response touched on the impact their concealment had been having on their children, the way that constant vigilance and careful monitoring of conversations had been creating an atmosphere of tension and anxiety within their family home. "Our children deserve to grow up in a household built on honesty and trust," she said simply. "We couldn't continue asking them to keep secrets they didn't understand for reasons we couldn't explain." The press conference continued for nearly an hour, covering questions that range from the constitutional implications of their revelations to the personal impact on their marriage and family relationships. Each answer revealed another layer of the complexity they had been navigating, showing the human faces behind the royal titles and the real consequences of decisions that had to balance personal desires with institutional obligations. The most emotionally charged moment came when James Patterson from the Times asked about their fears regarding public reaction to their honesty. Catherine's response, delivered with tears she didn't try to hide, spoke to the vulnerability that their revelation had created while also expressing hope for understanding and forgiveness. "We know that some people will be disappointed in us, and we accept that," Catherine said, her voice steady despite her visible emotion. "But we hope that people can see that we've tried to do what we thought was best in an impossible situation, and that we're committed to being completely honest moving forward, regardless of the personal cost." William's concluding remarks addressed the broader implications of their decision for the monarchy itself, acknowledging that their choice to prioritize truth over tradition might require institutional changes that went beyond their personal situation. His words carried the weight of someone who understood that he was potentially reshaping the very institution he would someday lead. The monarchy has survived and thrived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing times and evolving expectations, William observed. If our honesty today helps the crown become more human, more relatable, and more authentic in its service to the British people, then we believe the temporary discomfort will be worth the long-term benefit. As the press conference concluded and the media representatives dispersed to file their stories and analysis, William and Catherine remained in their seats for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The weight of their secret, carried for so many months, had been lifted from their shoulders, replaced by uncertainty about the future, but also by a sense of relief that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The immediate aftermath brought a flood of communications from family members, government officials, and international partners, each responding to the unprecedented nature of their revelations with various degrees of support, concern, and curiosity. King Charles's message was brief, but powerful in its unconditional backing of their decision, while Princess Anne offered practical advice about managing the media attention that would inevitably intensify in the coming days. The children's return from their school activities provided both a welcome distraction and a sobering reminder of the new reality their family would now need to navigate. George's questions about the unusual number of reporters gathered outside the palace gates prompted the first of many conversations they would need to have about privacy, public service, and the responsibilities that came with their royal heritage. That evening, as London settled into darkness around them, William and Catherine sat together in their private quarters, watching news coverage of their press conference and beginning to process the reactions that were emerging from around the world. The response was more varied and nuanced than they had expected, with expressions of support and admiration for their courage mixed with criticism of their earlier deception and concern about the precedent their transparency might establish. The constitutional experts who had warned about potential parliamentary intervention proved to be overly pessimistic, as government officials rallied around the royal couple with expressions of support that emphasized the human elements of their struggle rather than the institutional implications of their choices. The Prime Minister's statement, released within hours of their press conference, praised their honesty and commitment to transparency while affirming the government's continued confidence in their ability to serve the crown. International reaction proved equally supportive, with monarchies around the world expressing understanding for the difficult position William and Catherine had found themselves in and admiration for their decision to prioritize truth over convenience. The global response suggested that their courage in embracing vulnerability might actually strengthen rather than weaken the international reputation of the British monarchy. The most meaningful responses, however, came from ordinary citizens who reached out through social media and traditional channels to share their own stories of difficult choices and family struggles. The outpouring of personal support revealed how deeply their honesty had resonated with people who faced their own challenges in balancing family obligations with professional responsibilities. As the days passed, William and Catherine discovered that their decision to embrace transparency had indeed changed their lives. But not in the ways they had feared. The constant anxiety about discovery and exposure was replaced by a new kind of public attention that was more intrusive in some ways, but also more honest and authentic in its acknowledgement of their humanity. Their children adapted to their new reality with the resilience that had always characterized their approach to the unique challenges of royal life. George, in particular, seemed relieved to understand finally why there had been so many serious conversations and worried faces around the palace, and his acceptance of their explanation helped his parents recognize that their fears about damaging their children had been largely unfounded. The monarchy itself proved to be more resilient than even its strongest supporters had predicted, with public opinion polls showing increased support for the royal family in the weeks following William and Catherine's revelations. Their willingness to acknowledge mistakes and prioritize truth over image seemed to resonate with a public that had grown weary of institutional deception and carefully managed public relations. In the quiet moments between public engagements and official duties, William and Catherine often reflected on the journey that had brought them to their moment of truth. The pain of their secret had been replaced by the challenges of increased scrutiny, but those challenges felt manageable in ways that their concealment never had. They had chosen to trust the British people with their truth, and that trust had been rewarded with understanding and support that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Their choice to prioritize honesty over comfort had indeed changed everything, but it had changed their lives in ways that made them stronger, more authentic, and more committed than ever to serving with integrity the institution and the people they loved. The silence that had shrouded their deepest struggles was replaced by a transparency that, while sometimes difficult, allowed them to face the future with clear consciences and open hearts.